Redwoods and earthquakes. Two of my mum's sisters, Kathleen and Bernadette, and her brother Teddy, had emigrated to America before I was born. The girls had gone to the West Coast and took their friend Fran with them and settled in San Francisco. Teddy had opted for the East Coast and ended up in New York. In the intervening years, several of my cousins had taken a trip over there, and now a trip for my sister and I was on the cards, largely thanks to Freddie Laker. Laker Airways and its pioneering SkyTrain service between London and New York was probably the forerunner of the cheap, no-frills air travel we now enjoy today. We went for 3 weeks, and our journey started with a drive to Gatwick to catch the plane. My dad's cousin John Rice drove us down there in his car because my dad didn't drive, and mums really didn't drive in those days, so any holidays or excursions we took as kids involved public transport. I had never been outside of the country for a holiday, unless you can count the Isle of Man, and exotic holidays abroad were the domain of the rich and famous. I remember my dad's sister Monica going on holiday to Spain during the early 70s, and we actually went to Speke Airport to wave her off. She was only going to Benidorm, not the moon. It probably took us longer to get to Speke on the 81 than it did for her to reach Spain. I'd been on 2 holidays to the Isle of Man, one when I was 2 years old and the other when I was a teenager, and we'd had some good times in Newquay, St Ives, Ayr and Whitley Bay, but also some not so fond memories of a week in a caravan in Barmouth. I am sure that part of the Welsh coast is an absolute delight if you were in a seafront hotel overlooking the sun-drenched beach. My experience was a week in a caravan, in a field next to the owner's farm, stuck indoors while the torrential rain hit the roof so hard you had to shout to be heard above it. A week of board games ensued. I learnt more new words playing Scrabble with my dad that week than I'd learned in secondary school. There were holidays in places like Colwyn Bay, Llandudno and Anglesey, all excellent scores in Scrabble if they would have been allowed, and I always enjoyed them, especially visits to the Welsh castles at Harlech and Carnarvon. But the prospect of being on a plane for 8 hours, let alone flying across the Atlantic, was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. We landed at San Francisco Airport and are collected by Auntie Fran. She wasn't really our auntie, but she was the same age as my other aunties back in Liverpool, so everyone called her Auntie Fran. She was a hard-working waitress. I'm not sure there is any other type in the US, and she lived in a flat in an apartment block in Berkeley. My sister slept in a spare bedroom, and I was on the couch, which was no discomfort because, like all things in America, it was huge. My greatest memory of being in Fran's place was lying on the sofa late one night watching TV. Fran is sitting in her armchair, curlers in hair, book in one hand, ciggy in the other, and a cup of tea by her side. As we're watching TV, there's a short rumble, and it felt as though a giant had bumped into the apartment block and given it a nudge. It rocked and then stopped. I immediately sat up and said to Fran, "What was that?" Without looking up from her book, and without even looking at me, she replied in her transatlantic drawl, "It's just an earthquake, love." She probably would have shown more of a reaction if the rumble had spilt any of her tea. "It's nothing to worry about, love," she continued. "It's good to have little ones now and again. That way the pressure don't build up too much and the ground don't split in two." I couldn't believe her casual attitude to living on a time bomb that might see the ground split and her and her fag brewing curlers drop into the San Andreas Fault. I went out to her local shop to buy some candy, and whilst I was walking along her road, a middle-aged woman passed me by and said, "Hey, nice sneakers." Whilst I was there, I had purchased a pair of Adidas SL72s in green and yellow, and the garish colours caught her eye. I thanked her, and she noticed I was not from round their way and asked me where I was from. When I told her, she said to me, "I have a cousin in England. Maybe you know him. His name is Christopher." "Is he in Liverpool?" I asked. "No, he lives in Sheffield." Confirmation that people in America think Great Britain is a village. She followed this statement with another that most Scousers visiting the States will have heard. "You talk just like the Beatles." She was a very nice lady, so I think I can forgive her lack of English geography and her inability to know the difference between the accents of posh Southenders and Norris Green Scallies. We also spent time with my Auntie Kathy and her husband Manny. They had 2 daughters, little Kathy and Teresa, and they both treated us to a couple of outings, one of which I'll remember for all the wrong reasons. We drove in Teresa's car to a shopping centre to see the Amityville Horror at the cinema there. We buy our tickets and ice cream and head for the entrance to the auditorium, passing the ticket ripper on the way. He was a slim black guy dressed up like Buttons from Cinderella, in a red suit with brass buttons and a pillbox hat perched at a jaunty angle on his head. As we approached, he said in a comedic voice, "3 tickets for terror," and made a woo noise like you heard on the ghost train. Teresa took the tickets from him without even looking and replied, "Fuck you, nigger." I was mortified. I couldn't believe that she could just cut him dead like that for no reason, when all he was doing was being friendly and making the most of his shit job. It seemed the kick in the head I'd received months earlier for being an anti-racist was nothing compared to what was being suffered by black people over here. The 2 other highlights of the trip were going to Disneyland in Anaheim with Fran's daughter Barbara and her son Billy, and travelling north up the Pacific Coast Highway to Gualala Point County Park with Barbara's brother Michael. We drove from San Francisco to Disneyland in Barbara's Gremlin. The AMC Gremlin is a 2-door hatchback, and we had over 600 miles to look forward to. There were 2 ways of getting there: the longer winding Pacific Coast route down Highway 1 with views of the ocean all the way there, or the shorter Highway 5 route, a straight line through the desert. We had to take the shortest route, so instead of trying to spot dolphins out of the window, we saw nothing but scrubland, and the temperature was over 100, and we had no aircon. All thoughts of an uncomfortable journey were obliterated when we reached Los Angeles and checked into a motel and went to sleep dreaming of Space Mountain, the 2-year-old indoor roller coaster that had just been added to Mickey's Kingdom. Countdown to blast off. Nobody is too old for Disneyland. I'm pleased to say that over the years I've been to the Anaheim one many times, and in 2005 took my own kids to the Florida branch, and I've never had anything but a fantastic time. My first steps into the Magic Kingdom were not disappointing. I'd been to Southport Fair and been to the fairs that rolled into council parks in Liverpool, but nothing was like Disneyland. We were queuing outside before the gates opened, and once inside headed for Space Mountain. Even being in the queue was entertaining. It was so well organised. Time markers all along the queue to let you know how long you would be waiting, and once inside the building the queue would wind through several chambers, all of which felt like being on the Starship Enterprise. Our party climbs into a shuttle and we are strapped in ready for takeoff. Amazing. Flying around in the dark, taking sharp bends at 70 miles an hour. It certainly knocked spots off the Mad Mouse in Southport. Even the more sedate rides like It's a Small World with its miniature singing puppets were just as entertaining. Pirates of the Caribbean was stunning and made your average ghost train back home look like something they'd made out of cornflakes boxes on Blue Peter. The day was topped off with the best fireworks display I've ever seen. It was an exhilarating 2 days, and the long drive home flew by, our minds being too full of Disney to worry about the heat or the distance home. Fran's son Michael was going to take us north on our next trip. Michael was a real Californian cool cat. Give him a cold beer and a seat in the sunshine and he'd be happy. To me, he was the personification of laid back. My sister and I, Michael and his boys, and my other cousin Lisa and her boyfriend Robert were going camping at Gualala Point County Park. This time we did take the coast road, and although I don't remember much about the scenery en route, I do remember being greeted by the huge redwoods on our arrival. We were going to set up camp beneath the trees and very close to the winding river that cut through the trees. I'd only had one previous camping experience, and that was a weekend away in Anglesey with a school pal. It was totally forgettable. From the leaving behind of the can opener and the shitty tent to the piss and rain and terrible public transport, my first camping experience should have been enough to put me off for life. This was something else though. Time was spent walking in the woods and taking trips in long aluminium canoes along the river. It was like Deliverance but without the male rape and the cockeyed banjo player. It was so peaceful, and whilst gliding along the river the only sound to be heard was the birds in the trees and the paddles stroking the water. Unlike Wales, the sun was beating down and casting shadows of the redwoods across the water. It was truly idyllic. When we were settling down for the night, we had no need to sleep under canvas as it was so warm, and the campfire in the middle of us was enough to ensure we didn't get cold. My sister and I had wanted to sleep around the campfire, and Robert and Lisa joined us. We were chatting until it went dark, and Robert asked us if we smoked back in England. I was a smoker, and I think our Joanna dabbled, so we both said yes and expected him to break out a pack of Marlboro. Instead, he pulls this little roll-up out of his pouch and lights it up. He explained that it was grass, and he passed it around and we all had a puff. I don't remember feeling particularly stoned, but I think I was sleeping within the next hour. It was hardly the Beatles and Bob Dylan taking tea, but what a place to have your first drug experience, sitting around a campfire under the majesty of the California Redwoods. And despite having smoked drugs all over the world, I don't think I've been in a more beautiful arena. Americans smoked their grass neat and had little tweezers to hold the butt of the joint close to their lips without burning their fingers. Some pothead somewhere must have thought deeply about the problem of singed nose hairs and burnt fingers and come up with the perfect solution. I've never seen cigarette papers anywhere in the world like the ones I am about to describe. They look like normal skins with a gummed edge at the top, but at the bottom the paper had been wrapped round a very thin piece of wire. So when you rolled up, you had a wire running down the side of your joint, which would become exposed as you burnt away the grass. As the joint gets shorter and becomes too hot to handle, then you bend the wire at 90 degrees and use it to hold the joint to your lips. You get the last hit off the joint and no burnt fingers. Genius. Only in California, the spiritual home of the head. I did some record shopping while I was there, and the favourable exchange rate meant that records were half price. I got a couple of Zeppelin albums and a US import of the Clash's debut that had extra tracks on it. Americans didn't really know about punk then, especially on the West Coast. The cheapest items in the record stores were 8-track cartridges. I'd never seen these and wondered if they were a new format. I wished I had an 8-track player back home, because from the look of the prices on these things, they were giving them away, and I would have happily ditched half my clothes in order to stuff a ton of these in my case. A week before we were due home, I had to call my house and find out my O-level results. Paul Barry had gone over to my house, and my mum opened the envelope. She read out the letters and asked Paul if the results were any good. Being the honest Catholic boy he was, he told the truth. No, they were terrible. English language, C. Geography, D. Maths, E. Physics, E. Spanish, U. French, U. Biology, U. Religion, U. English literature, U. Those last 7 grades meant that I had the nickname Huey for a few weeks after I returned home. Think about it. I was glad I wasn't there to be red-faced in front of my parents at my shameful performance. Still, to quote Joey Ramone, I was out there having fun in the California sun, so the plans for my future could be on hold for a week. Whilst we're talking about California, I have to say something about California girls. No wonder Brian Wilson wished. My female cousins were all beautiful and looked like they could have walked onto the set of Dallas without anyone batting an eyelid. Maybe it's the sunshine that makes the blonde hair a little blonder and the long legs just a little bit longer, but to a hormonal 16-year-old, they all look stunning. When we were waved off at the airport, I didn't know when I would see my American family again. I was going back home to uncertain employment, and whatever job I could get would see me saving for years before I could afford to visit them again. I didn't know that I would be back within 4 years, with 4 pals, and we would be the biggest band in England.